I recently bought some rats to breed as feeders for my snakes, and so I thought that I would share with you my experience and also some of my research about rats and respiratory infections, bacterial infections. My reading, in my reading, I discovered that all rats, except for rats that are bred specifically in a lab setting, carry the Mycoplasma bacteria. Most respiratory infections that rats get are bacteria called Mycoplasma Pulmonis, which mostly affects the lungs and upper respiratory system, but can also result in systemic symptoms. It can even cause, eventually can cause diarrhea, difficulties wanting to eat, weight loss, and sometimes death. A lot of people who breed rodents themselves for their reptiles may not be aware how prevalent this is, but I did quite a bit of research among people who are sort of in the rat community, and there's quite a lot of evidence that it's much more common than people think. Sometimes rats who carry it may not themselves be sick, but they have the capacity to infect others that have less strong immune systems and make them sick. A lot of people believe that respiratory infections in rats are mainly just, induced by poor husbandry, not changing the bedding enough, that kind of thing. That can cause it. It can cause it to erupt and become symptomatic, but it doesn't always. Some rats can be in the best, cleanest settings and still contract the disease. A lot of times, mycoplasma can start off with very subtle symptoms. You might hear the rat breathing funny. When it breathes in and out, it may make a squeaking, kind of chirping sound. Your rat, if it's healthy, should really not make these kinds of sounds. Generally, rats are completely silent unless they're hurt or frightened. They might make one or two squeaks, but if you hear a sort of constant in and out breathing, squeaking, or chirping, or whoop whoop kind of sound like a guinea pig, that's not normal, and it is cause for alarm. If you breed a lot of rodents for your snakes, if you have a large collection and you have whole racks full of rats, it may not be feasible to take all of them to the vet and have them individually tested to confirm what it is and then assess what antibiotics to give. In cases like this, the best course of action is to just use a broad spectrum antibiotic, such as Amoxicillin. That actually is now considered the first line antibiotic for rats with respiratory infections. A lot of vets are a little reluctant to use it, or they have been in the past, and often prefer Bacterial because it has less capacity to upset the stomach. But I know from my experience, I've had my rats on Amoxicillin for now 5 days. I started them on Friday night and have been giving it every 12 hours. And I really have not seen loosening in their stools. In fact, actually, when they came to me, their stools were horrible. A lot of them were very mushy. They were not solid the way a healthy rat is supposed to be. the poop smelled really bad, and it seemed that they were not able to adequately clean themselves because of how sick they were, and their bodies actually smelled. This is another sign. If you have a rodent and their body smells, that's not normal, because rats generally, if they are well enough, they will clean themselves when they get poop or pee or anything on their fur or on their skin. They're very fastidious animals. So if you have a rat that stinks, their actual body stinks, their fur, or they have staining on their tail, that is a sign that there's probably some infection going on, and they do need to be treated with antibiotics. You might wonder how you obtain antibiotics if you don't take all of your rodents that are affected to the vet to get a prescription. Well, there's a little known fact in the rat community that for some small animals like fish and birds, you can get the exact same antibiotics. They're no different than the antibiotics you get for a dog or a cat or even a human. But for certain animals, they're not regulated. And there have been dosage charts that have been worked out by veterinarians who have written papers and other people who have been in rat rescue for many years. One woman, I think her name is Debbie Ducommun. She is no longer living, but I think she recently died around March sometime. I had actually written her email to try to get some further information, but she wrote a whole book on rat healthcare, which is very interesting, and she actually included a number of these charts on the internet, even if you don't buy the book. She has has laid out sort of a whole protocol for treating rats with these infections. And I know that there's a number of sort of, I guess, variations on this protocol. If you go to different sites, there may be slight inconsistencies, but I came up with a fairly simple way to mix the antibiotics with flavoring, so that it wasn't quite so complicated, because unless you actually have a grain scale for weighing pharmaceuticals, it's not that easy to take a pill and then to divide it out and figure out how much is each dose. So what I figured out was that for most rats usually don't weigh more than about a pound, and depending on their age and size, they can weigh quite a bit less than that. Most of the ones that I have weigh anywhere from maybe a quarter of a pound or maybe a little less, and then I have one large breeder male that probably weighs about a pound. And what I figured out is you can sort of average it out. A lot of the material says that if you have amoxicillin fish medication, that it's made by a one of the most recommended ones is a medication called Fishmox, and you can see here the one that I got was 500 milligram capsules, but you can get it in 250 milligrams also. The material for the 250 milligram dosage says to mix about 1.5 to 2 tablespoons of flavoring material. That means jelly, fruit, baby food, anything that is a little bit thick that you can mix the powder in and disguise the bitter taste. Yeah, so basically, yeah, that for 250 milligram capsules, you mix in 1 capsule to 1.5 or 2 tablespoons of flavoring material, and you just keep it in a little jar. It will stay, if you keep it in the refrigerator, you can keep some of this mixture for 2 or 3 weeks, and it's still good. And but for the 500 milligram capsules, all you do is, since it's double strength, you just double the amount of flavoring material that you mix with it. And what I do, I basically mix 4 tablespoons of flavoring material. I use generally mashed banana and a little bit of mashed strawberry. They love banana. Most rats really like the taste of banana, so that's pretty safe if you're going to choose a flavoring material that they are likely going to eat. Not all rats like it. I have one, my Ruby, my hairless Dumbo rat, the albino. She is a little finicky, and she won't just eat it off the spoon. If you find that they're not really readily licking it off the spoon or off a little dish, you can try several other techniques. You can actually take it and put it on some sort of a crispy treat that they like. Rats really love crunchy stuff. So if you put it on something like Special K cereal that has crunchy flakes, just sort of, take a quarter of a teaspoon measure and take a little scoop. Generally, I give a quarter teaspoon of the mixture to each rat. And if you're finding that there are certain ones that are hogging it, you can take the ones that are a little more passive out and put them in a little bin separate from the others to make sure that they get their proper dose. Yeah, you can put it on some sort of a treat if they don't lick it right off the spoon or the plate. And another trick you can use if they still don't do that, and Ruby is a little bit tricky with that too. She will eat the little pieces of cereal with that smeared on it, but sometimes she'll actually take it and then she'll take it somewhere else in the cage and she'll drop it. And I have to keep sort of handing it to her several times. Sometimes she'll eat it and sometimes she won't. And another trick that you can use if they're very finicky and you're having a difficult time getting it into them is to take the dose that you have and basically smear it onto their side or their flank. And rats, being a little bit OCD, they don't like to have anything on them. So what they'll do is they'll instinctively lick. And so then they'll get the dose off of their own fur or their skin by licking it off. I've been pretty successful using one or more of these techniques with all of my rats to get them to take the proper dosage. And I've found that they, just in 5 days, they've improved considerably. I also bought doxycycline as a backup. I know that the material lists a number of antibiotics that you can use, and depending on the strain of mycoplasma that the rat has, some antibiotics work better than others, but they usually recommend that you start off with amoxicillin. Then if you don't see noticeable improvement within the first 3 days, then chances are it means that you need to add another antibiotic or change antibiotics. Then go to doxycycline. Other antibiotics that are recommended are cefadroxil, and that's generally for secondary infections, and it's best used in combination with gentamicin, chloramphenicol, Bactrial, doxycycline. You can use a combination of Bactrial and doxycycline. You can use gentamicin in combination with cefadroxil, or Amoxicillin in combination with cefadroxil. As I touched on a little bit, rats can also get other secondary infections once they are symptomatic from mycoplasma. That often weakens their immune system, and they're more susceptible to secondary or opportunistic infections. So that is often why, if you're having trouble getting it under control, oftentimes it may be more than one bacterial infection that the rat has. Usually rats that have been kept in some of these, I guess, for lack of a better word, rat mills. There are suppliers that just mass breed rats, and they don't really pay close attention to illnesses and things like that. A lot of times these illnesses can spread within their collection, and this is all the more reason why it's good to have these antibiotics on hand. Even if you think, oh well, I'm not going to need it, my rats are fine, I don't see any symptoms of infection, they all seem healthy, they're not making any strange noises, they're not having any respiratory problems. There's always a first time for everything, and it's better to be safe than sorry, because think about it. Even if you're not breeding them as pets and you're breeding them as feeders, I remember seeing a video by Gavin from Balls to You talking about quality feeders being important in producing quality, healthy snakes. So, you want to be sure that your rats are as healthy as they possibly can be before you feed them to your snakes, because there is a possibility that a respiratory infection in a rodent can pass to a snake. It hasn't been really ruled out, and so why take the chance? So these antibiotics actually, in the grand scheme of things, are not very expensive, and I think I probably paid about $50 for both of these, 30 capsules of 500 milligram amoxicillin, and then the other one that I bought, the doxycycline. Let me see if I can show you this. It's called Bird Biotic, and I bought it from a website called AliVet. You get 30 packets. It comes. This antibiotic comes in packets of powder, and each separate doses. And together, those two cost me just under $50. So, initially you might think, well, if you only paid 30-something for the rats that you just bought, you might think, well, is this really worth it? But in the long run, it is, especially if you plan on breeding rats long-term, and they're going to be having litters, which you're going to then be feeding to your snakes. Even if you don't have a lot of extra capital set aside for incidentals like this, it's probably good to stock up on these antibiotics that you can buy over the counter online, and maybe just buy a few bottles here and there sort of over time and stock up on them, so that way if anything does come up with an outbreak in your in your rat collection, that then you have it on hand and you don't have to wait for it to come in the mail, and meanwhile they're getting sicker and that kind of thing. This one, actually, this was the one that I think I talked about briefly in one of my previous videos. That was when she came to me. She was initially pregnant, and the guy sold her and her mate, which is the big breeder male, to me, and she was about ready to deliver, and she actually delivered. It was either that night or the night after, and turned out that at that time I wasn't fully aware that they were sick. I was watching them just to see how they did, but I hadn't done quite as depthy research as I did later on once I realized that something was wrong. And I found that she, when she did deliver her litter, she had 5. One of them was stillborn. And then I noticed that she wasn't nursing them. And so I'm not sure whether she wasn't producing milk. Sometimes mother rats will abandon their young if they're not able to produce milk or not able to produce sufficient milk. And sometimes it may just be because they're not feeling well. And I suspect that with her, it may have been a combination of things. She's an adult, but she's still fairly young. It may have been her first litter, and from what I read, sometimes rats, the first time around, inexperienced mothers may not immediately have the mothering instinct kick in. Some do and some don't, and some develop it later on in the next few litters. And some of them really don't have it at all. So I'm hoping that this was just a one-off situation, and now that she's been treated with antibiotics, that she will be able to breed successfully and take care of her litter in the future. I'll probably try her again once she's a little more stabilized, and see how she does the next time. But she actually was one of the ones that was worst affected by the infection, and although I don't know if you can hear, she still makes a little bit of a wheezing sound when she breathes, but it was way worse when I got her from the guy that I bought her from, and I suspect that he was probably keeping them in unclean conditions. The breeder male seemed like he had literally never had a bath in his life. The other ones I was able to clean up pretty easily, but with him, I think because he's probably the oldest one. I don't know. He looks to be a few years old. It looks as though he's almost never been handled, and he's very unsocialized. The others warmed up to me very quickly, but I'm still trying to tame him and get him used to being touched and that kind of thing, because he actually will bite if you put your hand in the cage and you're not careful. I actually tried to let him sniff my hand. I lay it out just sort of in front of him and kept it still. Most rats won't consider that a threat, and they'll come up and sniff it. They might nibble a little bit, but he actually dug in hard, and so now I'm having to be a lot more careful with him. But when he first came to me, he was in horrible condition. The guy sort of came to my house. He was in a big rush. He took the money. He kind of put the rats in my cages and rushed out the door. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to observe them before he left. And then I did try to contact him. I think it was the next day, as soon as I realized that they were sick and that they needed treatment. And he really didn't want to take any kind of responsibility. He was kind of arrogant and really sort of acted like, oh my gosh, this has never happened before. This is a real anomaly. And I kind of could tell that it probably wasn't, but he wasn't going to admit that. So, you know, I know, and if I had had a better option, you know, and I could have gotten my rats from, you know, somebody with real credentials, I would have, but where I live, it's kind of limited. So I had to kind of take my chances. There were really only 2 people that I had to choose from that were accessible to me. And so the first guy that I dealt with, I think, was actually a lot better, but a lot of times he was hard to get a hold of and hard to set up a time with. And my snakes really needed to, you know, to get something into them. I never feel very comfortable about letting them go too long without food. The male is very picky, and he really wouldn't take frozen thawed. He would only take live, but he's also more timid than my female. He was intimidated by some of the larger rats, even the frozen thawed. He sort of acted afraid of it, and but I found that with him, weanlings really were the best. He would take those, and you know, he wouldn't refuse those. And I tried smaller ones and also somewhat larger ones in frozen thawed and in live, and he turned up his nose at it. But I wanted to say also that as far as you know, as far as looking for sources for your feeders, it's probably a good idea, if you can get them to tell you, you know, ask them what they do in the case of, you know, if they discover that some of their rats are sick and they're sneezing or making squeaking noises in their, you know, in their breathing. If I had really known to do that beforehand, I would have probably questioned him a bit further. But, you know, a lot of these things you just don't, it just doesn't occur to people who breed reptiles, because, you know, they specialize in reptiles, not so much rodents. And but I definitely got quite an education once I had to deal with this myself. It was sort of, you know, a little bit of a crisis, and but it was well worth getting the antibiotics and treating the rats, because these things are manageable if you catch them in time. I had, I think, 2 of the rats that he sold me die, and that was before I was able to get the antibiotics in the mail. But the others, you know, the others hung in there, and I was able to treat them, and it definitely is paying off, because I'm noticing that their fur is lying down. It's smoother, it's shinier again, it's softer. A rat that's sick oftentimes will hunch up, and you'll see the fur looks kind of fluffy and sticks out and that kind of thing. but I could really see, just even with the first dose, I noticed that they all became much more active. They were moving around more. They were moving quicker. They were more inquisitive. And so far things are looking very hopeful, and I think I'm going to be able to finally breed for my ball pythons. The other positive thing about this is that if there's any question, a lot of people sometimes wonder if their ball pythons, if they're not eating or something like that, and they may wonder if their ball pythons might have a subclinical respiratory infection. So if you're feeding rats that themselves are being treated with antibiotics for respiratory infections, then once they get to a certain point where they're no longer infectious, that's an added benefit. So that will be going into your snake, and it's not enough where it could cause any problem. You have more to worry about when you're giving the rats this, whether they're getting enough rather than getting too much. You can't really overdose them on antibiotics unless you give them massive amounts. But yeah, this can also, in a sense, inoculate your snakes. So it'll be very interesting to see how things go with this. I think there's a lot of positive that can come out of this negative situation that I encountered. But hopefully this is something that will be helpful to other breeders, people who are breeding a certain number of rodents for their snakes. And because I don't see a lot of this discussed in the in the reptile world. It's mostly discussed only among rat people. So hopefully this will be of help to you now or in the future. I hope that you don't ever need to use it, but it's good to have these on hand in case you do. One other thing I'd like to mention is that there is something that you can do preventatively. It may not be a guarantee, but it can definitely help to give your rats on a maintenance basis a probiotic. There is a product called Bene-bac. I'm in the process of ordering it now. I don't have it with me, so I'll provide links to some of these things in the description. But there's a product called Bene-bac, which is a powder. It's got probiotic and prebiotics in it, and a lot of the rat people recommend it for maintenance supplementation because it can help strengthen your rodent's immune system and therefore make it less likely that they will become sick with one of these infections. And I think a pound of it is around $18, $18 to $21, depending on where you buy it. But from what I understand, it goes a really long way. So you just basically sprinkle it on their food, and then when they eat the food, they get the probiotic as well. So if you like this video and you feel you got something useful out of it, please leave a comment, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Hope this has been informative.